So this is our Ponty reading group. We are starting chapter 4 of the structure of behavior. So this is page 185 of the translation. So we finished chapter 3 last time. So that chapter was about the three orders of reality, or three forms of I guess conceptualization or discourse about the world: the physical order, the vital order, and the human order. And what is the sort of connection between these different orders, what are the differences, etc. And sort of culminating in the last one, the human order, what is characteristic or specific about this order is that it is a kind of for itself order, or it's an order that has this for itself aspect to it. So part of what it is for something to be in the human order is for the participants in that order to have some awareness of it. So the example that I talked about last time is that, like, part of what it is to be a parent, being a parent, of course, is a sort of element of the human order. So part of what it is to be a parent is precisely how you understand what it is to be a parent. You model yourself on other people that you consider to be good parents, or you, I don't know, read books about parenting, or you make decisions based on what it is to be a good parent, and so on. All of this, like, part of what shapes the reality of being a parent, or the activity involved in being a parent, is that person's understanding or awareness of what parenthood consists in. As opposed to, in the case of other animals, there are, of course, all kinds of behaviors involved in raising offspring and so on. But if you think of a bird or a dog or whatever, they're not sort of aware of what it is to be a parent. They just do things that they're, that they sort of want to do or have this desire to do as part of their offspring raising behavior, but they don't, like, I don't know, consider what it is to be a parent and act accordingly. So this is what's, like, characteristic of the human order. And I guess the question that arises in connection with that, that he talked about a little bit, but I think is going to be more explicitly discussed in this chapter, is, what is the relation between that explicit awareness of, say, what it is to be a parent, and the sort of prior, and what it is that you are aware of. So to be aware of something, that whatever it is you're aware of has to exist as well, right? There has to be something like your being a parent before you can, be aware of your being a parent. And so what is the relationship between these two things? And so we talked about this quite a bit last time, this sort of dialectical, he sometimes uses that term, this dialectical relationship between implicit and explicit. And so for Merleau-Ponty, the implicit aspect, or the implicit side of something, is always prior in nature, or more fundamental than the explicit. So this sort of engagement with the world, and especially in the case of perception, this is like his core topic in all his writings. Especially in the phenomenology of perception. But this perceptual, or this sort of immediate engagement with the world, we talked about in the section on the vital order, this capacity to grasp structure, or this articulation, or this sort of melodic awareness. This is, like, one of the key concepts of this book. So we have this sort of immediate grasp of this structured situation, or this structured experience. This is like the implicit side of things. But then out of that implicit awareness, or this implicit experience or engagement, we can also make certain elements the focus of attention, or we can become aware of some element. And so he wants to sort of avoid two, I guess, opposite errors, or opposite misunderstandings of this bringing something to awareness. So on the one hand, it's not the case that we can make everything explicit at the same time, or become aware of everything at the same time. So, like, if you're listening to a melody, listening to a song, or a composition, or whatever, you can focus on some aspect, one instrument part, or you can focus on one line, or focus on the harmony, or whatever. But by virtue of focusing on one element, you are not focusing on some other element. There's something that you are not explicitly aware of that sort of recedes into the background of your awareness. And then and then even more so if you're focusing on the music you're listening to, you are thereby not focusing on your visual awareness or like the tactile sensations of your clothes touching your skin and so on. All these other things are sort of part of the background of your awareness that you are not focusing on. So that you can think of this as a sort of like a spotlight in the center of your field of awareness. You can turn the spotlight in different places, but there's always this dark region or this only partly illuminated region surrounding the spotlight. And this is like a sort of essential structure of awareness as such. It's not possible to illuminate the whole field of awareness at the same time. There's always that dark region surrounding it. But then the sort of converse error or the opposite misunderstanding would be to think that there's some sort of intrinsic difference between what you're aware of and what is in that obscure region or that is not lit up by awareness. So there would be the error would be that thinking that there's like something intrinsically obscure or intrinsically not capable of coming to awareness. And so for Merleau-Ponty, there's like part of what makes this implicit engagement with the world a kind of experience in the first place, or part of our experience, is precisely the fact that it can be made, that we can become aware of it, that it can become sort of the focus of attention. So something that, like, I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen in our bodies that we are not capable of becoming aware of, except maybe like through the mediation of instruments of some kind. So like, I don't know, the state of my bones, for example, is not something that I can like sort of feel or experience or whatever. I can go to a clinic and get an x-ray taken to see what my bones look like, but that's like a much more sort of mediated process through this instrument and looking at a picture and so on. Yeah, so there's all kinds of things going on, in my body that are, I guess, part of what makes me capable of having an experience, but they aren't part of my experience as such. Whereas, on the other hand, things like, like I mentioned earlier, the tactile sensation of my clothes touching my skin, even if I'm not explicitly aware of it, if it's not sort of under the spotlight at the moment, I always can turn my attention to it and make it the focus of my awareness. And so, everything. So that you can't make everything. You can't be aware of everything at the same time. You can't put everything under the spotlight at the same time, but you can turn the spotlight to anything at some time. That's sort of the position that he wants to set out between these two opposite errors. Okay, so I think that's like more or less where we got to last time in terms of the human order. And then so the problem now is like how do we understand the relationship between these different orders? Is one more fundamental than the other in some sense, or more real, or whatever? Yeah, that's like the sort of general problem in this whole chapter. Okay, so if someone would like to read from the beginning of this chapter and go through a page or so.
I can read. Chapter 4, the relations of the soul and the body and the problem of perceptual consciousness, the classical solutions. That naive consciousness is realistic has been affirmed too much, or at least a distinction should be made in this regard between the opinions of common sense, the manner in which it verbally accounts for perception, and the perceptual experiences themselves. Verbalized perception should be distinguished from lived perception. If we return to objects as they appear to us, when we live in them without speech and without reflection, and if we try to describe their mode of existence faithfully, they do not evoke any realistic metaphor. If I adhere to what immediate consciousness tells me, the desk which I see in front of me and on which I am writing, the room in which I am and whose walls enclose me beyond the sensible field, the garden, the street, the city, and finally the whole of my spatial horizon, do not appear to me to be causes of the perception which I have of them, causes which would impress their mark on me and produce an image of themselves by a transitive action. It seems to me rather that my perception is like a beam of light, which reveals the objects there where they are, and manifests their presence, latent until then. Whether I myself perceive or consider another subject perceiving, it seems to me that the gaze, quote, is posed, unquote, on objects and reaches them from a distance, as is well expressed by the use of the Latin lumina, for designating the gaze. Doubtless, I know that my present experience of this desk is not complete, that it shows me only some of its aspects, be it the color, the form, or the size. I know very well that they would vary under another lighting, from another point of view, and standing in another place. I know that, quote, the desk, unquote, is not reducible to the determinations with which it is presently clothed. But in immediate consciousness, this perspectival character, my knowledge, is not conceived as an accident in this regard, as an imperfection relative to the existence of my body and its proper point of view. And knowledge by quote unquote profiles is not treated as the degradation of a true knowledge, which would grasp the totality of the possible aspects of the object all at once. Perspective does not appear to me to be a subjective deformation of things, but on the contrary, to be one of their properties, perhaps their essential property. It is precisely because of it that the perceived possesses in itself a hidden and inexhaustible richness, that it is a quote unquote thing. In other words, when one speaks of the perspectival character of knowledge, the expression is equivocal. It can signify that only the perspectival projection of objects would be given to primitive knowledge. And in this sense, the expression is inexact, since the first reactions of an infant are adapted, for example, to the distance of objects, a fact which excludes the idea of a phenomenal world originally without depth. From the beginning, the perspectival character of knowledge is known as such and not something to which we are subjected. Far from introducing a coefficient of subjectivity into perception, it provides it, on the contrary, with the assurance of communicating with a world which is richer than what we know of it, that is, of communicating with the real world. The profiles of my desk are not given to direct knowledge as appearances without value, but as quote-unquote manifestations of the desk. Although naive consciousness never confuses the thing with the manner in which it has of appearing to us, and precisely because it does not make this confusion, it is the thing itself which naive consciousness thinks it is reaching, and not some inner double, some subjective reproduction. It does not imagine that the body or that mental quote-unquote representations function as a screen between itself and reality. The perceived is grasped in an indivisible manner as quote-unquote in itself, en soi, that is, as gifted with an interior which I will never have finished exploring, and as quote-unquote for me, for moi, that is, as given quote-unquote in person through its momentary aspects. Neither this metallic spot which moves while I glance toward it, nor even the geometric and shiny mass which emerges from it when I look at it, nor finally the ensemble of perspectival images which I have been able to have of it are the ashtray. They do not exhaust the meaning of the quote-unquote this by which I designate it, and nevertheless it is the ashtray which appears in all of them. So this, I guess what he seems to be doing here is describing the way objects present themselves to what he calls naive consciousness, and arguing that naive consciousness does not take its objects to be representations, but in a way which may be kind of hiding in initial implicit contradiction, takes the objects to be both what they really are in themselves and what they really are for us at the same time. Kind of reminds me of the beginning of, which is probably deliberate on Merleau Ponty's part, but the beginning of the phenomenology of spirit, where we see these movements in the object.
Oh, we lost Angus. Let's just wait a minute or two for him to reconnect.
What happened? When did Dan?
Yeah, so you were talking about the phenomenology of spirit. That was where you disconnected.
Shoot. Okay. Yeah. It just so this idea that in Hegel, spirit is trying to work out the relationship between itself and the object as it appears to it, and yeah, that for Merleau-Ponty, the object, for at this moment at least, is both in itself and for the subject. I think is what I said.
Yeah, I think what he's trying to do here at the outset is sort of to just set out the sort of common sense, I guess, presuppositions about perceptual access to objects without putting them into like a consistent theory at the outset. So just like, what is it that we presuppose when we engage with objects in our surroundings when we, I don't know, say that we can see the cup on the table or whatever. Just sort of, common sense understanding of what it is to perceive objects. And so we, someone who doesn't read philosophy books will never sort of come to the, or generally will not like think of the idea that, oh, maybe like everything that I perceive is actually just in my head. It's just a bunch of representations, and the world is actually something completely different, or it's a, a evil spirit that is making me have these ideas. So this is like the sort of common sense presupposition, is that we are actually capable of perceiving the objects themselves and not just our sensations or our ideas of those objects. But then at the same time, there's this again another sort of presupposition of this sort of common sense awareness of objects, or this common sense understanding of what it is to perceive objects, is that the experience of the object, or what the object looks like, varies according to where I'm standing and looking at the object, and what angle I'm seeing the object from, what the lighting is, what my state is, whether I'm suffering from certain illnesses that can affect perception and so on. So there's this awareness that in our perceptual access to objects, there is a certain sort of element or part of that experience that varies from subject to subject and from time to time, and so on. But yeah, so this common sense understanding of what it is to perceive an object includes both the capacity to perceive that object itself and not just a sort of representation of that object, but also the understanding that how we perceive the object, or what sort of appearance the object presents to us, will vary in accordance with what we could call, I guess, subjective conditions. So both of these things have to be, an adequate account of perception would have to fit both these things in. Like they would have to make sense of how these two presuppositions are both fulfilled in our perception. Yeah. So so in response to Bat's question in the chat here, yeah. So I think yeah, I think Angus, the way you put it in the chat is right. I think he's sort of presenting, yeah, this sort of naive consciousness, or what is it that we want to explain, is like how is it the case, or what is behind our everyday, or supposedly naive understanding of perceiving objects. So we need to figure out what it is that we want to explain first, before we can actually go about trying to explain it. And so yeah, it's a sort of description of this naive consciousness without without sort of presupposing that it's already like consistent. We don't know for sure yet that all these different presuppositions that are part of this naive understanding of perceptual experience will actually be consistent, and maybe we have to drop one of them, or modify them, or whatever. But the first step is just to describe what this sort of naive understanding of perception is, and then we do the sort of explanatory and possibly revisionary step that we would maybe need to modify that conception.
I was kind of wondering, as I was reading this through the first time, like whether this is a accurate description of naive consciousness. Like, I don't know. I guess it depends on what we mean by naive consciousness, but it seems like it's pretty common for people to to think that the body or the brain produces representations of images. Although maybe this is maybe he's describing the naive consciousness of 1940s France or Paris. But yeah, I don't know. I want to find it convincing, but I'm not sure I totally agree.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe one like objection sort of along the lines of what you're pointing to is that it might not be possible to sort of separate out this like I guess pre-theoretical domain of naive consciousness that yeah, like the sort of picture, I guess, that we can whether this is exactly what Merleau Ponty wanted to express or not, but the picture we can take out of this account is something like there is this like naive conception of perceptual awareness, or of experience that is pre-theoretical, and then later in life or later in history, this sort of theoretical account of perception in terms of representations of objects and so on is introduced, and then so we have to sort of get behind or underneath this theoretical conception to sort of recapture that naive conception. And so yeah, the objection would be that maybe there isn't actually a way of sort of separating out these two I guess layers or spheres or whatever you want to call them. That yeah, there wouldn't be such a thing as this naive conception that is pre-theoretical, that is like given to us or immediately present in us before any sort of theoretical account of the nature of perception. And I think that's plausible. Maybe what Ponty would want to say is that even if like chronologically in terms of say like the development of a human child or through history, even if it is the case that there is never something like this naive conception without some kind of theory of perception, we can still make like a logical distinction and say that this theoretical account of perception is still grounded in this pre-theoretical understanding of what perception is, even if chronologically they never like even if chronologically they appear at the same time or they sort of develop simultaneously. You could still argue that the pre-theoretical grasp of the nature of perception is more fundamental, that the theoretical grasp sort of depends on the pre-theoretical one. But yeah, I don't think he sort of explicitly makes that case, but maybe you could sort of read that into what he's saying, or supplement what he's saying with an argument for that position instead.
Yeah, that's a good point. One other thing I just thought of, I've read in a couple of places that Merleau-Ponty argues sort of against Husserl that there is this truth to the natural attitude, which makes a complete phenomenological reduction impossible. I think this is later on he talks about an argument against skeptical doubt as against methodological doubt, that skeptical doubt sort of presupposes what it doubts. I think he makes a similar argument about at least the so-called Cartesian reduction in Husserl. But yeah, I guess this is just something I'm going to try to keep in mind as we go through this section, whether he does argue for a truth to the natural attitude, and sort of what that means for his system.
Yeah, I think that I think this is connected to some of what we talked about. That quote from Phenomenology of Perception that I posted a couple weeks ago, and I think we talked about it a little bit during one of the sessions. The way that for Merleau-Ponty, there's this sort of requirement to engage with causal accounts of experience and of mental or spiritual life, whatever exactly you want to call it, human. The specifically human level, we have to engage with these causal accounts that primarily come from psychology, even if we sort of presuppose that these are not adequate to capture or to explain, or this ambition to like provide a causal explanation of the human order is not something that is even achievable in principle. But we still have to engage with those accounts and sort of show how they like internally like lead beyond themselves to a more adequate grasp of the human order, rather than what I think Husserl does is more or less just to sort of like deny that they have any value at all, or like they have value only insofar as you can treat them as objects of phenomenological inquiry, and so they don't actually tell us anything about experience. They're objects that we can study phenomenologically. And so yeah, so I think it's a much more, I guess, careful and sophisticated interaction with psychology and other causal explanations of experience. Even though, of course, he denies that, like in principle, these accounts could ever be adequate. He wants to like sort of work through the difficulties of each of these proposals in sometimes minute detail, looking at like specific experimental setups and so on, um, uh, rather than just sort of like sweeps them away like as a whole in the way that Husserl sometimes does. Even things like the Copernican hypothesis and heliocentrism, he's like slightly ambiguous about how much we should consider this to be like a truth about the world as opposed to like part of the representation of the world in physics and so on. So yeah, it's a very different approach to like empirical science and explanatory accounts of experience than Husserl's. And so yeah, I think this is like an instance of the same kind of move of like working through the problems within those accounts rather than just sort of negating them as a whole. Also, before we go on, I just wanted to make note of the fact that you can tell this book was written in the 1930s because his example is an ashtray, which no one would ever like take as an example in the 2020s or the 21st century. But yeah, so we can go on to the next bit, the first full paragraph of 187. Someone else would like to read?
Yeah, I can read. This is not the place to analyze further the paradoxical relation of the quote-unquote aspects to the thing, of the quote-unquote manifestations, to that which is manifested by them, and beyond them. But what we have said is sufficient to show that this relation is original and founds a consciousness of reality in a specific manner. The perspectival appearance of the ashtray is not to the quote-unquote ashtray itself what one event is to another event which it announces, or what a sign is to which it signifies. Neither the sequence of quote-unquote states of consciousness nor the logical organization of thought accounts for perception. The first, because it is an external relation, while the perspectival appearances of the ashtray are representative of each other. The second, because it presupposes a mind in possession of its object, while my will is without direct action on the unfolding of the perceived perspectives, and because their concordant multiplicity is organized of itself. A quote-unquote cube is not what I see of it, since I see only three sides at a time, but no more is it a judgment by which I linked together the successive appearances. A judgment, that is, a coordination conscious of itself, will be necessary only if the isolated appearances were given beforehand, which is counter to the hypothesis of intellectualism. Something of the empiricism which it surmounts always remains in intellectualism, something like a repressed empiricism. Thus, to do justice to our direct experience of things, it would be necessary to maintain at the same time, against empiricism, that they are beyond their sensible manifestations, and, against intellectualism, that they are not unities in the order of judgment, that they are embodied in their apparition. The quote-unquote things in naive experience are evident as perspectival beings. It is essential to them both to offer themselves without interposed milieu and to reveal themselves only gradually and never completely. They are mediated by their perspectival appearances, but it is not a question of a logical mediation, since it introduces us to their bodily reality. I grasp in a perspectival appearance, which I know is only one of its possible aspects, the thing itself which transcends it. Okay, I'm sorry, I read that in a weird way. So I grasp in a perspectival appearance, which I know is only one of its possible aspects, the thing itself which transcends it. A transcendence which is nevertheless open to my knowledge. This is the very definition of a thing as it is intended, vice by naive consciousness. Whatever difficulty one may find in conceptualizing perception, described in this way, it is for us to accommodate ourselves to it. This is the way that we perceive and that consciousness lives in things. Nothing is more foreign to perception, therefore, than the idea of a universe which would produce in us representations which are distinct from it by means of a causal action. To speak Kantian language, the realism of naive consciousness is an empirical realism, the assurance of an external experience in which there is no doubt about escaping quote-unquote states of consciousness and acceding to solid object, and not a transcendental realism which, as a philosophical thesis, would posit these objects as the ungraspable causes of quote-unquote representations, which alone are given. The bodily mediation most frequently escapes me. When I witness events that interest me, I am scarcely aware of the perpetual breaks which are blinking of the eyelid, of the perpetual breaks which the blinking of the eyelids imposes on the scene, and they do not figure in my memory. But after all, I know very well that I am able to interrupt my view by closing my eyes, that I see by the intermediary of my eyes. This knowledge does not prevent my believing that I see things themselves when I look at them. This is because the body proper and its organs remain as the bases or vehicles of my intentions, and are not yet grasped as quote-unquote physiological realities. The body is present to the soul as external things are present. In neither case is it a question of a causal relation between the two terms. The unity of man has not yet been broken. The body has not been stripped of human predicates. It has not yet become a machine, and the soul has not yet been defined as existence for itself, bourgeois. Naive consciousness does not see in the soul the cause of the movements of the body, nor does it put the soul in the body as the pilot in his ship. This way of thinking belongs to philosophy. It is not implied in immediate experience. Do I stop here or do I keep going on?
Maybe you can go on another couple paragraphs.
Okay. Since the body itself is not grasped as a material and inert mass or as an external instrument, but as the living envelope of our actions, the principle of these actions has no need of being a quasi-physical force. Our intentions find their natural clothing or their embodiment in movements and are expressed in them as the thing is expressed in its perspectival aspect. Thus, thinking can be quote-unquote in the throat, as the children question by Piaget say it is, without any contradiction or confusion of the extended and the non-extended, because the throat is not yet an ensemble of vibrating chords capable of producing the sonorous phenomena of language, because it remains that privileged region of a qualitative space where my signifying intentions manifest themselves in words, since the soul remains coextensive with nature, since the perceiving subject does not grasp himself as a microcosm into which messages of external events would make their way immediately, and since his gaze extends over the things themselves, to act upon them is not for him to get outside the self and provoke a local movement in a fragment of extension. It is to make an intention explode in the phenomenal field in a cycle of significative gestures, or to join the things in which he lives the actions which they solicit by an attraction comparable to that of the first unmoved mover. One can say, if you like, that the relation of the thing perceived to perception, or of the intention to the gestures which realize it, is a magical relation in naive consciousness. But it would still be necessary to understand magical consciousness as it understands itself, and not to reconstruct it from subsequent categories. The subject does not live in a world of states of consciousness or representations from which he would believe himself able to act on and know external things by a sort of miracle. He lives in a universe of experience, in a milieu which is neutral with regard to the substantial divisions between the organism, thought, and extension. He lives in a direct commerce with beings, things, and his own body. The ego as a center from which his intentions radiate, the body which carries the beings and things to which they are addressed, are not confused, but they are only three sectors of a unique field. Things are things, that is, transcendent with respect to all that I know of them, and accessible to other perceiving subjects, but intended precisely as things. As such, they are the indispensable moment of the lived dialectic which embraces them. I can keep going on. The next two paragraphs start with but, so I'm not sure if it's going to be a bit too
much. Let's stop here because we don't have another like section break or anything coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is one of these passages that I think just sort of continually moves on to like it's just a continuous chain of ideas that doesn't have any like natural breaks in it, so we can stop pretty much anywhere. Yeah, so here he's again coming back to this point that he's made a couple of times before, this idea that intellectualism as a kind of opponent of empiricism is actually sort of adopting a lot of the presuppositions of empiricism that it actually should not adopt, or that are not correct or appropriate presuppositions to adopt. And so what we need to sort of overcome the issues and limitations of empiricism is not just to sort of add on something like a judgment, or in more sort of computational language, like processing of sensations or something like that. This doesn't really get us past all the problems that he's identified in these sort of naive empiricist or associationist theories. We need something that is neither empiricist nor intellectualist. And so he gives like, I guess, a few, I mean, he doesn't give us like a whole theory at this point of what that would look like, but like some pointers towards what that means. And so, for example, in the case of perceiving a desk or a cube or some other physical object, we only see it from a certain perspective. Of course, you only see some side, 1 to 3 sides of a cube, at most 3 sides of the cube at any given time. But at the same time, we don't that our visual experience is not of 3 parallelograms connected to each other in some pattern, like a sort of maybe empiricist conception would say that we only really see these 3 parallelograms, and then as a result of conditioning or habit or association or whatever, we sort of are led to believe that there is a cube that these 3 parallelograms are the sides of, and then the intellectualist sort of counter to this would be to say, no, it's not just habit or association or whatever, but we're judging that there is a cube. We sort of posit the existence of a cube as an intellectual construction that underlies or that explains the appearance of these parallelograms. And yeah, so his account is going to be an alternative to either of these descriptions of the perception of the cube, and it's that we see the sides of the cube as parts of the cube, as sides of the cube. So our perspective on the cube is precisely a perception of these sides as being the sides of a cube, and not as we don't sort of have an immediate grasp of these parallelograms that we then sort of have to put together into a cube, either through association, conditioning, or whatever on the empiricist side, or through an intellectual process on the intellectualist side. And it's actually, and we've talked about this before, it's actually quite difficult to learn to see those parallelograms and like draw an accurate perspective on a cube. When you sort of go to art school or art classes or whatever, you have to practice this skill of seeing the angled, the parallelograms that are the distorted or the bent perspectival appearance of the square sides of the cube. They're not immediately given to us in our perception. You have to learn how to perceive them and reproduce them accurately. And so, yeah, our sort of immediate or like the most fundamental form of perceiving the cube is precisely perceiving the cube under the appearance of of perspective, or through the perspectival experience. And so we are aware of the cube itself by means of how it appears to us under a certain perspective, rather than being aware of the perspectively bent or distorted appearances of the sides of the cube. And so, yeah, it's a different way of sort of framing what it is that we are aware of and what perception consists in, as opposed to starting from, being immediately given these ideas or representations and then having to figure out how we get outside those representations to the object that they are supposed to represent. So I think, so in response to Bat's comment in the chat here, I think he wouldn't say that what we're aware of when we see the cube is something like internal structure. I think what he would say is that what it is to see a cube is precisely to see it under a certain perspective, with this sort of implicit understanding that perspective will change in this appropriate structured pattern as we move around or pick up the cube and move the cube. So like seeing a cube is precisely seeing this perspective appearance of the sides of the cube such that those sides would change in the appropriate way. Like if you saw a cube and then you turned around the other side and it like turned out to be just a flat piece of paper that was like very cleverly drawn in such a way to look like a cube, then you would say, oh yeah, it's not really a cube. It's just a drawing of a cube. And so like it's not just the yeah like these Looney Tunes the painting of a tunnel on the wall that sometimes allows you to walk through it and sometimes doesn't, depending on who it is who's trying. So like this like part of what it is that we perceive. So when I perceive a cube, I see it as something that I would be able to see from other sides, like that awareness of being able to see the other side of it, and the other side being like connected to this side in the expected way is part of what I am grasping when I see it as a cube. And then if I walk around the cube or pick up the cube and turn it, and something unexpected appears, that it doesn't sort of have the other side that I think it would, or that I expect it to have, then I'm surprised, and I consider my previous perception of it as a cube to have been incorrect. And so this is an alternate account of what it is that I guess of the content of our perception. So the content of our perception is precisely the structured relationship of these different perspectives to each other, as opposed to both the empiricist and the intellectualist accounts start from the presupposition that the immediate content of perception is something atomic, like these sensations or representations or whatever, that we then have to sort of do something to or with to reach the underlying cube. And then there's always the question of like, how do we know that we actually are grasping that cube behind our perceptions or behind our representations? And he wants to just sort of avoid that whole problem, which is a sort of artificial. It's like an artifact of that starting point from those atomic sensations, and you can never really get out of that problem if you start from there.
Parts of this, the beginning of this chapter, remind me more of the beginning of Phenomenology of Spirit, and parts remind me more of Division 1 of Being and Time. It's this idea that the body is not grasped as a material mass, but this is the living envelope of our actions, that there's a kind of invisibility to the body, or it's not present to us, certainly not in an anatomical way, when we're just kind of going about our day. It's pretty close to, the distinction in Heidegger between the ready to hand and present at hand. And he'll talk about sickness as sort of the origin of this kind of reflective thematization of the body later on, which I think can be seen as corresponding to the hammer breaking example.
Yeah, and even in Hegel, there's a passage, I think, in the Encyclopedia of Logic, where he's talking about what is the relationship between logic as an academic discipline or as an object of study, and then reasoning. And he says like you no more need to study logic to be able to reason than you need to study physiology to be able to digest food. So obviously you can engage in digestion without knowing anything about what it is that's going on in your digestive system. You don't need to like study a physiology textbook to like figure out how to do it. Fortunately, and the same thing with reasoning for Hegel, that we engage in reasoning. What it is to be a human being is to be able to engage in reasoning for Hegel. But the science of logic, studying logic as a discipline is sort of making that reasoning ability explicit in a way that it wasn't before. So yeah, it's a similar kind of argument here that our perceptual grasp of the world is not dependent on understanding the physiology of the eye and optics and so on. You can think of even like Plato's account of visual perception is that there's a beam of light that comes out of your eye and reaches the object, and that's how you see something, which of course is completely incorrect from our perspective. So his whole theory of visual perception is like wrong. But of course, it doesn't mean that Plato didn't know how to see things. People who had these incorrect theories of visual perception or no theory at all of visual perception were still quite capable of seeing objects and understanding that if they picked up the cube and turned it around, they would see the other side of the cube and so on. So this pre-theoretical understanding of perception is there, before any theoretical account, and even if you have an incorrect theoretical account of perception. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Sorry, I lost track of where we ended. Bats, what was the last bit that you read?
So, yeah, the bottom of 189. So I didn't start the paragraph that starts with but.
Right, but on the other hand, that's the one?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, yeah, so I'll read the next bit. Okay. But on the other hand, consciousness discovers, particularly in illness, a resistance of the body proper. Since an injury to the eyes is sufficient to eliminate vision, we must then see through the body. Since an illness is sufficient to modify the phenomenal world, it must be then that the body forms a screen between us and things. In order to understand this strange power of the body to upset the entire view of the world, we are obliged to renounce the image of it which direct experience gives us. The phenomenal body, which the human determinations which permitted consciousness not to be distinguished from it, with the human determinations which permitted consciousness not to be distinguished from it, is going to take on the status of appearance. The, quote, real body, unquote, will be the one which we know through anatomy, or more generally, through the isolating methods of analysis. An ensemble of organs of which we have no notion in immediate experience, and which interpose their mechanisms, their unknown powers, between ourselves and things. One could still conserve the favorite metaphor of naive consciousness and admit that the subject perceives, in conformity with, his body, as a colored glass modifies what the beam illuminates, without denying him access to the things themselves or putting them outside him. But the body appears capable of fabricating a pseudo-perception. Thus, certain phenomena of which it is the seat must be the necessary and sufficient condition for perception. The body must be the necessary intermediary between the real world and perception, which are henceforth disassociated from each other. Perception can no longer be a taking possession of things which finds them in their proper place. It must be an event internal to the body and one which results from their action on it. The world is doubled. There will be the real world as it is outside my body, and the world as it is for me, numerically distinct from the first. The external cause of perception and the internal object which it contemplates will have to be separated. The body proper has become a material mass, and correlatively the subject withdraws from it to contemplate its representations within himself. Instead of the three inseparable terms bound together in the living unity of an experience which a pure description reveals, one finds oneself in the presence of three orders of events which are external to each other. The events of nature, the organic events, and those of thought, which will explain each other. Perception will result from an action of the thing on the body and of the body on the soul. First it is the sensible, the perceived itself, to which the functions of extramental things are attributed. Then the problem is to understand how a duplicate or an imitation of the real is aroused in the body, then in thought. Since a picture makes us think of what it represents, it will be supposed, based on the privileged case of the visual apparatus, that the senses receive, quote, little pictures, unquote, of real things, which excite the soul to perceive them. The Epicurean, quote, simulacra, or the, quote, intentional species, unquote, new quotes, all those little images fluttering through the air, unquote, which bring the sensible appearance of things into the body, only transpose the ideal presence of the thing to the perceiving subject in terms of causal explanation and real operation. It is the former, as we have seen, which is an evidence for naive consciousness. In default of a numerical identity, the philosopher seeks to maintain a specific identity between the perceived and the real, to have the distinctive characteristic of the perceived come from the things themselves. This is why perception is understood as an imitation or a duplication in us of sensible things, or as the actualization in the soul of something which was in potency in an external sensible thing. The difficulties with this explanatory mythology, explanatory mythology encounters would not have to be mentioned if they issued only from the realism of the sensible, which has been abandoned since Descartes. In fact, they are the permanent difficulties of any causal explanation applied to perception. The Descartes of the dioptrics rejects the transitive action by means of which sensible things, identical with perceived objects, would impress their image in the body, where the soul would find it. Since light is only a movement, there is no need to suppose any resemblance between the things external to the body, the physiological phenomena, and what the soul perceives. And, moreover, even if the perceived object resembled the bodily phenomena which condition perception or their external causes, perception would still not have been explained. Quote, even if this painting, by passing into the interior of our head in this way, still retains something of a resemblance to the objects from which it proceeds, one must still not be persuaded that it is by means of this resemblance that it causes us to sense them, as if there were other eyes over again in our brain with which we could apperceive. One should hold rather that it is the movements which compose it, which, acting immediately on the soul, inasmuch as it is united to our body, are constituted by nature to cause the soul to have such feelings. The external thing and the bodily impressions do not act, therefore, as exemplar causes. They are the occasional causes of the feelings of the soul. But all the difficulties are not removed. If the cerebral impressions are only the occasional causes of perception, there must still be a regulated correspondence between certain cerebral impressions and certain perceptions. One has indeed gotten rid of the myths which made the idea of a real transference of sensible things into the mind inevitable. But one is obliged to construct physiological schemata which make comprehensible how sensory impressions are prepared in the brain to become the adequate occasions of our perceptions. Since we perceive only one object in spite of the two images which it forms on our retina, only one space in which the givens of the different senses are distributed, it will be necessary to imagine a bodily operation which combines these multiple elements and provides the soul with the occasion of forming a single perception. Thus, the substitution of occasional causes for exemplar causes does not eliminate the necessity of placing some physiological representation of the perceived object in the brain. This necessity is inherent in the realist attitude in general. So this is sort of trying to give an account of how this causal sort of psychological account of perception that he's been criticizing throughout this book sort of arises out of this naive conception of perception that he's been describing so far this chapter. So when everything sort of goes according to plan, we perceive the cube in this direct manner that we just see the cube under a certain perspective rather than seeing like shapes that we then have to reconstruct the cube out of, and so on. We have this sort of direct encounter with the objects themselves. But then, of course, we also have these experiences of, you have like, I don't know, if you stare at the sun for a while, then you see like spots in front of you which you recognize are a result of the state of your eyes and are not, brought about by perceiving objects floating around in front of your head or something like that. Or even like more sort of banal experiences like you turn out the light in your bedroom or whatever at night, and then you can't see anything, and then after a minute or two you can see, and so you recognize that there's like certain states, that there are changes in the state of your perceptual systems that make differences in terms of what you can perceive or how you perceive things. And then there's certain illnesses that can affect your perception, like if you have a cold you can't taste things very well, you can't smell very much, etc. And then there's the famous illusions that were sort of a recurring theme in ancient Greek philosophy. The bent stick classical example. You put a stick in the water, and intellectually that the stick is straight, but the part of the stick under the water looks like it's at an angle to the part of the stick above the water. So all these experiences of illusions or perception that doesn't give us this immediate access to the world that we normally have lead us to this understanding of like a division between the perceived world or the representation of the world in our experience, and then the world that it represents or that it's related to somehow, that we want to get access to through our perception. And especially like maybe the next step in this whole process is the supposition that when we are subject to an illusion of some kind, our experience is subjectively indiscernible from the true perception of what the illusion seems to depict. So like, if you're a coyote looking for your lunch and you see a train tunnel conveniently located in this wall that you would like to pass through, and you are under the illusion that this tunnel is actually a real tunnel, your experience is subjectively indiscernible. So there's nothing you can distinguish from within your experience that would tell you that this tunnel is actually a painting of a tunnel and not a tunnel you can really run through. So this is the sort of supposition that leads to this account of perception, in terms of which what is given in perception is this sphere of appearances or representations that we that are brought about in some way by the objects, and that we have to use to get to the objects that are their causes, as opposed to having a direct access to the objects themselves. So this is maybe sort of like the default naturalistic account of perception, I guess, or maybe not even naturalistic, but explanatory or causal account of experience, that probably most psychologists would hold some version of this picture of perception to be correct. Probably maybe a more like sophisticated version of it, but this is like the general picture that they presuppose in their work. But if you start like thinking about this account a little bit more carefully, it doesn't really hold up very well. It falls apart pretty quickly. So he talks about some of the objections or some of the issues that Descartes already runs into when he's one of the first people to really articulate this account in a explicit way that tries to present it as a consistent theory. So, for example, there's the question, of course, of what it is about the objects that gives rise to our perception of them. So, how exactly are the objects out there in the world related to my representations of those objects? And like maybe more naive version of this is like Epicurus's account, where the objects are literally giving off streams of atoms that float through the air and strike our sensory organs, like our eyes. And so there's like little shells or clouds of objects that they're constantly giving off that enter into our sensory system, and that's like the explanation of how we perceive them. And what Descartes points out is that even if this were true, even if there is like a little cloud of a coffee cup that travels through the air and enters your eye, that still doesn't really explain how you see the coffee cup in your eye, the cloud of the coffee cup. You still need, like, you would have to have like another little eye inside your optic nerve that could see the cloud of the coffee cup that has entered your eye. And so you haven't really gotten anywhere. You just like push the problem inside your head, but you still have this question of like, how does this cloud or shell or whatever of the coffee cup come to be perceived in the first place? But Descartes himself doesn't really give us much of a better explanation of this. He just says that so he says we can't suppose that the objects cause our ideas of those objects in this sort of physical sense. The causal relationship between the object and my body is the occasion for me to have these ideas, but it is not the cause of those ideas in that direct sense. But what exactly this relationship of occasional causation consists in is something that he actually thinks is surpasses human understanding. The unity of the body and the soul is something that we can't understand. We just know that that there is this unity, but we can't understand how it is that God could have put my body and soul together. So this is obviously not super satisfying. Saying that, oh, actually the whole thing I was trying to explain is something that we can never understand. And then there's all these weird bits that Descartes ends up having to get to, like the pineal gland thing that that Merleau-Ponty is alluding to here. So the fact that we have a single perceptual experience, so we have two eyes, but we see one object rather than two sort of floating images of the object. We have to suppose that there's one portion of the brain or one area of the brain where those images end up and all get and where the soul can sort of see them or observe, or the occasioning of ideas in the soul is brought about in this one place, in the pineal gland. And so there's lots of reasons to think that this is not a great account of perception. And there's in addition to this, I don't think Merleau-Ponty talks about this exactly here, but there's the question, the sort of reverse relationship between the soul and the body is the question of how is it that my soul is able to bring about movements in my body. And Descartes' account of this depends on his account of motion, according to which the quantity of motion is conserved. So my soul is not capable of adding to the quantity of motion in my body, but the direction of motion is not conserved. So my soul is capable of moving changing the direction of the flow of animal spirits in my nerves, conceived as this sort of hydraulic system, and by means of changing the direction of these animal spirits, it can cause the muscles in my body to contract or expand and bring about motion in that sense. So this all depends on his account of the physics of motion, which also has a lot of problems. And anyway, so like the whole account of the relationship between the body and the soul relies on this unity that surpasses human understanding, and also relies on this fairly dubious physiology of the pineal gland, and also fairly dubious understanding of the nature of motion. So yeah, there's a lot of issues with this whole account of the relationship between the body and the soul.
Yeah, so just trying to kind of follow the thread of the argument here. I'm not that familiar with Descartes, honestly, but the problem with these external causal accounts of perception for Merleau-Ponty seems to be that whether they hold that an exemplar or like an internal representation of the object is somehow emanated into the mind, or there's this indirect occasional cause account. They need to in either case account for he says that, or there's still the necessity, as he says, of placing a physiological representation of the perceived object in the brain. And it seems like this is the problem with this for him is going to be that we perceive the entire perceptual field in accordance with these kind of rules of rules of equilibrium that he has described in earlier chapters. And so as I understand it, the argument is that you can't really account for how sort of physiological representation of the object gets produced, because that doesn't really happen in perception. There's a kind of holistic perceptual field where the size of the image on the retina doesn't necessarily correspond to the perceived distance of the object, for instance, which is not explicable on this at least naive or simplistic theory of external causality. Does that sound right? Kind of.
Sorry, I was multitasking. As far as I could. As far as I was following, I think that sounds right. Maybe could you just give a one sentence summary again, just so I can confirm?
The problem with these external causal accounts of representation is that they need to, as he puts it, place a physiological representation of the perceived object in the brain, but there isn't really a physiological representation. There isn't a direct transcription of the object into perception. There's a whole perceptual field governed by these rules of equilibrium, which we've studied in earlier chapters.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, so I guess the part of what he's criticizing throughout this book, and what he's sort of appealing to here, is this notion that that it even makes sense to say that someone perceives something atomic or unstructured. And you can compare this to, I guess, Sellers and the Myth of the Given and so on. Though of course it's a very different approach to this whole problem. But all the theories that he's criticizing, the empiricist and the intellectualist and so on, they all presuppose that having a single sensation is a possible experience. That perceiving a red patch or hearing C# or whatever is a possible experience just on its own. And for Ponty, this is not the case. That we only ever our experience is always structured, even in the most basic forms of like being aware of some aspect or element of experience, while the rest is sort of in the background. So this figure ground distinction is like an intrinsic structure of what it is to have an experience in the first place. And then in much more like I guess structured form in visual experience, we perceive shapes and colors and so on that are all related to each other in different ways. And all the things that he talked about, like color constancy and so on, are part of this, and they make up the structure of experience, as opposed to being like imposed on something structureless or like filled up with these structureless atoms or something like that. And so our whole account of perception has to start from this intrinsic structure, as opposed to trying to explain these like elements of experience, and then building them up into some like structured or some version of the structured whole that we recognize in our in our normal understanding of experience.
This criticism of the what he calls exemplar causes, that and he quotes Descartes here saying that even if the painting somehow passed into the interior of our head, looking like the painting that it is outside of our head, we wouldn't come to sense it in this way, and that there would, in order for that to be an adequate explanation, there would need to be sort of something inside the head that is looking at the painting, the image of the painting that is produced. I've read this as fairly recently as a criticism of like a kind of naive representationalism in more contemporary philosophy of mind, that even if a representation of the perceived object is produced, even if we can think of the way the brain and the body relate to the object in terms of representation, that's not in itself adequate to explain the experience of the represented object, because then there would have to be like a homunculus inside your head looking at the representation, but still need to be kind of an experiencing endpoint, I guess. Although, yeah, I think Descartes' point is a bit different, but I guess it's somewhat similar.
Yeah, and actually, this I think exact argument about this idea that you putting the picture, the little painting inside your head would require another little man inside your head that would see the painting. I'm pretty sure Dennett uses this exact argument against what he calls a Cartesian account of the mind. And so it's interesting that Descartes is actually giving this exact argument. Yeah, the Cartesian theater. Yeah. So yeah, Descartes gives this exact argument, and so for him, for Descartes, I think the reason he thinks that he's sort of getting beyond this Cartesian theater or this homunculus account of the mind is that he doesn't presuppose any resemblance between the whatever it is that is in our brains or in our head, and the object outside of us. So I think for him the problem is the presupposition of resemblance primarily. And Brandom actually has some interesting stuff. I mean, he doesn't have like a sort of whole paper dedicated to Descartes, but one of his claims about Descartes is that like the fundamental novelty about his account of representation is precisely that it doesn't require resemblance, that he sort of breaks the connection between representation and resemblance, and he connects this, Brandom connects this with Descartes' introduction or popularization of what is now known as Cartesian coordinates. So you can draw a line on a piece of paper, and you can represent that line in terms of a set of pairs of numbers, that the x and y coordinates of that line. But of course, a set of pairs of numbers doesn't resemble a line in any like normal sense of the word resemble. It has this representational relationship by virtue of isomorphism of structure, but it doesn't look like a line or resemble a line in the normal sense of the word. And so for Descartes, I think this is sort of the model or paradigm of what representation is like in general. So the things going on in our brain or our optic nerve or whatever don't need to resemble the objects outside of us in any. So especially there's this whole conception of primary and secondary qualities that is part of the whole introduction of like early modern philosophy and the sort of post-Galilean picture of the world. So this idea that properties of objects like color, taste, etc., are not sort of intrinsic to those objects. That the world as such is not colored. It's only the way that objects affect our sense organs that brings about the experience of color. So all of these secondary qualities are something inside of us, but they don't resemble anything in the object. So there's nothing in the object itself that resembles redness or blueness or whatever. The sort of representational relationship is present insofar as there's an isomorphism between the color that I perceive the object as having and some intrinsic property of the object, like maybe the nature of the surface of that object, how that surface is constituted. So for Descartes, what he thinks is like the way of getting beyond this sort of homunculus conception is to understand representation as distinct from and not requiring resemblance. But I guess there's still the question of and as I mentioned, like there are a lot of problems with his specific account of perceptual relationship to objects. But the question is still like even if we accept that the things going on in my brain don't resemble the objects that I'm perceiving, there's still the question of what is it about those things going on in my brain that makes those representations into an experience. Because you can talk about like a map on a piece of paper that represents a landscape or a geographical area, for example. But that map itself is not an experience of that landscape. Even no matter how accurate or whatever other properties that map might have, it's not an experience of a landscape. And so if there are representations of some kind in my brain that are related to objects outside of me in this non-resemblance mode of representation, that doesn't in itself make those representations into part of an experience or elements of an experience. So it seems like we still have a similar problem, not exactly the same problem, but a similar problem of like who is using those experiences to grasp the objects or to reach those objects. It still seems like we need a little man to like look at the maps inside the head and go, okay, this angle on the map corresponds in a non-resemblance sense to this angle in the real world, or obviously that's like a very pictorial representation, but yeah, we still have the problem of what are these representations doing and how are they used, or how do they bring about something like an experience. Okay, maybe we have time for one more passage. If someone else would like to read, where did we stop? I think we're on 192. So we're at It Is Found Again, if I am not mistaken, on 192.
I can read unless 61 or Ollie, either of you would like to read.
I can read, but I can't. Wait, which one exactly? It Is Found Again?
Or yeah, exactly. On page 192, It Is Found Again. Yeah.
Okay, It Is Found Again. The pseudo-Cartesianism of scientists and psychologists both consider perception and its proper objects as internal or mental phenomena, as functions of certain physiological and mental variables. If by nature one means a group of events bound by laws, perception would be a part of nature, the perceived world a function of the real world of primary qualities. Then the problem is to designate in the body the adequate conditions of perception, just as Descartes is obliged to reserve the mediation of the body and perception to the pineal gland as a set of the common sense. So physiologists have had to give up designating facts to spatial, and chromatic values in the periphery of the nervous system and to make those which in perception are distributed over the different points of the visual field depend on the assimilation of the corresponding excitations into variable associative circuits. The guard pineal gland plays the role of the association zone of modern physiologists. Stop here or continue?
You can continue. Thanks.
As soon as one accepts as given, as real as wants it, that the soul sees immediately only by the interpretation of the brain. This mediation, even if it is not a transitive action, necessitates looking in the body for a physiological equivalent of the perceived. But the nerve functioning which distributes the spatial or chromatic values to the different points of the sensory field, and which in normal cases, for example, renders diplopia impossible, is not itself conceivable without reference to the phenomenal field and its laws of internal equilibrium. It is a process of a form, the notion of which is borrowed in the finer analysis from the perceived world. It is the soul that sees, and not the eyes, Descartes said, in order to get rid of the little images fluttering through the air. End of quote. The evolution of modern physiology shows that this expression must be taken absolutely literally and turned back against Descartes himself. It is the soul which sees and not the brain. It is by means of the perceived world, its proper structures, that one can explain the spatial value assigned to a point of the visual field in each particular case. The coordinate axis of the phenomenal field, the direction which at each moment receives the value of the vertical or horizontal aim, and frontal or lateral. Should I do like quote end of quote here? The answers to which are assigned the index quote immobile end of quote and with respect to which the remainder of the field appears quote in movement end of quote. The colored stimuli which are seen as quote neutral end of quote and determine the distribution of the apparent colors in the rest of the field. In the context of our spatial and chromatic perception, none of these result as effects from an intersection of mechanical actions. They are not a function of a certain physical variables. Gestalt theory believes that a causal explanation, and even a physical one, remained possible on the condition that one recognized the processes of structuration in physics in addition to mechanical actions. But as we have seen, physical laws do not furnish an explanation of the structures. It represents an explanation within the structures. They express the least integrated structures, those in which the simple relations of function to variables and can be established. They are already becoming inadequate in the quotes, a causal end of quotes domain of modern physics. And the functioning of the organism, the structuration is constituted according to new dimensions, the typical activity of the species or the individual, and the preferred forms of action and perception can be treated even less as the summative effect of partial interactions. Thus, the properties of the phenomenal field are not expressible in a language which would owe nothing to them. The structure of the thing perceived end of quote now offers a new support to this conclusion. Here or should we go the relation?
Let me just take a quick look ahead. Let's stop here because this is again a long sort of train of thought that doesn't seem to have a natural break in it. So thanks. We can stop here.
Okay, thank you.
So this is I think maybe just sort of following up what we saw in the previous section. So he's going through. So he talks about the pineal gland that I mentioned previously. So I was sort of jumping ahead of where we were. So Descartes' somewhat strange theory of the role of the pineal gland as the location where the union of the body and the soul is realized in some way that is beyond human comprehension. So that he's Nelson Ponty is suggesting here that a lot of the problems that arise in like contemporary psychology, whether in like behaviorist or reflex theory or these various forms of intellectualism, they all sort of end up having similar problems as Descartes had with his pineal gland, in the sense that we still need to have some we still like it's still sort of presupposing a causal explanation of how the body brings about experiences or perceptions in the soul, even if of course most psychologists today would not use that terminology. But there's still like there's some there's some like I guess causal relationship between events in the brain or structures in the brain or something going on in the brain and our experience. But it seems like as soon as you make this distinction in this way, or you set things up in this way, it seems like this problem is unsolvable. And there's like millions of articles that have been written about the hard problem of consciousness and so on. I think there's good reason to think that like trying to approach perception and the nature of experience and so on in this way is something that will never be solvable. Like you've set up the problem in a way that makes it impossible to solve. And so like what you could, I guess, take the lesson you could draw from that is that consciousness is something so mysterious and inexplicable that it's like something we can never subject to scientific explanation and so on, which is really not that different from Descartes' position that it's something that it surpasses human understanding, and that we just have to accept that God has united my body and my soul, and I even though I can't understand how he could have done that. But the alternate lesson I guess we could draw from this is the lesson that Merleau-Ponty is drawing, namely that the sort of setup of the problem itself has to be rejected. That we have to sort of that we have to get rid of this presupposition that that there is this sort of causal relationship between some sort of physical or physiological event going on in my brain and something at the level of experience. And then so then obviously the next step or the immediate question that comes up is how do we, what's the alternative picture, or what's the like saying that the other picture, the causal picture, is wrong doesn't in itself give us something to replace it with. And so what we hopefully will be getting in this chapter is more, he's already developed this to some extent, but like an account of how the articulated structure that, or this melodic perception, melodic experience, nature of this intrinsic grasp of structure in perception is sort of there all the way down, that we never have to start with something that is not already structured. And so this is what he means when he says that we have to sort of take Descartes at his word when he says that it's the soul that sees and not the eyes. So it's not the case that first there's like some causal or physical impact of rays of light on my retina that is then somehow like through some mysterious transmutation turned into some sort of experience in my soul or my mind or my consciousness or whatever. We have to see the whole process of perception as being like structured in as part of the human order, all the way down, like from the beginning. And so that's sort of like the refocusing or the shaping of the problem that he wants us to engage in.
I know we don't have much time left, but in a way, it kind of seems like, I mean, I know Merleau-Ponty rejects the idea of this association zone, but I remember earlier in the book, he argues that, I think he puts it, there's this qualitatively variable kind of global structuring function in what he calls the central sector of the brain, which, I mean, it is a kind of associative function, but maybe the difference between that and this idea of an association zone that he's dismissing here is that the central sector of the brain is not something that's sort of added on top of isolated reflex arcs for Merleau-Ponty. There really isn't like a hard line that can be drawn between the global structuration and the peripheral afference circuits. It's kind of, they all kind of happen at the same time. And then maybe the other point of departure would be that because it isn't localizable and because its effects are like globally structuring, the explanation refers back out to perception. So there isn't like a place where you can find the exact equivalent of the phenomena in the brain. It's that somehow this global structuration produces or is otherwise somehow related to the holistic phenomenal field. I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but I guess the difference to me, it seems to be this kind of structuration all the way down, and then the reference back out to the perceptual situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think so. He mentions sort of just in passing here about this notion that physical explanations are explanations that are within the field of experience, and he's talked about this before. That, like, of course, any physical experiment is done on objects that we perceive. At least the instruments that we're working with. Even if we're talking about atoms and electrons and so on that we can't perceive themselves, the only way you could do an experiment is to use some sort of apparatus or instruments or system of some kind that brings about something in perception that because of the design of the experiment, you have reason to believe that the nature of the atoms or whatever is related to the perceived state of the instruments after the experiment or after you've analyzed the data or whatever. So yeah, it's always within perception, and you can never sort of like step outside of the perceptual world and sort of see what things look like outside of perception. And so like this presupposition of the like maybe naive representational picture of perception, according to which we would have like our representations and then objects outside of us that those representations are the representations of, and a causal relationship between them. This has been sort of gone over many times in since Descartes, how like it sort of presupposes this picture of like stepping outside of that perceptual relationship and seeing it from the side. Like you can see the little object, the coffee cup or whatever, and you see the light wave striking the retina and like something happening in the person's brain, and then somehow that brings about the experience. But of course that would itself, even if you did see that, that would be an experience, that would be part of perception, as opposed to standing outside experience and seeing that perceptual relationship between the object and the person. So for that's one aspect of this rejection of this picture, in terms of which there would be something that perception would involve a representation of something that is not itself perceivable or not within the perceptual realm or the realm of experience.
I'm not sure. Like my question would be like related to the Angus question, but the part that I have just read is like, in a way I'm wondering like it has to do with some kind of objectivity. So for example, like if there is an object, and then if there is like seen or perceived by anybody as a same kind of object, and then they can say, I mean, that means some kind of objectivity of the object. But in the case of like if I see something and then with all kind of my prior previous experiences or kind of my senses, or I mean like particular senses of all mine, then the same kind of object can be perceived in different way. Is that, I mean, is that kind of like a idea here? Like I'm really ignorant of like Merleau Ponty and then Descartes either. So I'm just wondering like what Merleau Ponty says is like how we perceive an object. It depends on the person's think. It's kind of like all the kind of like amalgamations of all the experiences, all senses, and everything, something like that. So that could be all different. Would it be right? Nope.
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but I think I think what he wants us to get past is the idea that we have to understand perception in terms of a causal relationship with something that is not itself perceived. And this causal relationship or this explanatory account of perception would would sort of put us would like trap us inside our representations or in this like image of the world, and then like trying to explain how we can get outside of that, how we can actually know that those images are accurate images of the objects outside of us is this sort of insoluble problem. And then on the other side of it, like how these images themselves like are perceived or like how it is that images make up an experience is itself also not explained in this picture. So that, like on both ends, this account or this picture of perception has like these big gaps that seem to be like impossible to fill. And so what he's suggesting here is that we should like reject some of the presuppositions of this account and instead start from the sort of immanence of structure in perception, the fact that our experience is always experience of something structured, rather than something this sort of brute impact of the world on us that then has to be put together into a structure.
Yeah. So kind of like the part like the quote, like it is the soul that sees, not the eyes, and of course that the part says like I was wondering like what the soul here means. So if you think like eyes and the brain is some kind of like a part of science, and which means like which can be just measured or measured like so-called objectively, but the in the case of soul, I mean everybody has would have different soul, like according to their own experiences and so on, something like that. By doing that, probably Merleau-Ponty like try to highlight the differences, like I mean, what can be differently perceived, things like that, by according to the individual. Individual. Nope.
Yeah, so I think the soul here is not so much meant to be like understood as like something individual in the sense of so it's not, what is important about this soul side of things is not so much that there's like an individual or like subjective in that sense nature of the soul. I think what he means by soul here is more the fact that it's this like already human structure. So yeah, when he says that it's the soul that sees and not the eyes, the idea here is that our vision and more generally our perceptual experience of the world is not something that involves this causal interaction that is secondarily that brings about an experience. The experience is already like there from the outset, and it sort of extends all the way down through the whole process of perception. So he's using the terms. The term soul here is maybe more Aristotelian than like Cartesian in the way he's using it. So it's like the soul is the activity of the body. So it's like the soul is the perceiving that the body engages in, as opposed to something that is affected by the body and then undergoes a perceptual experience.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we're pretty much out of time here. So yeah, let's stop here and pick up next time. I'm not sure how much more we have left in the book actually. Let me just take a look. So we are on 193, and if my PDF will work. Yeah, so we have about 30 or so pages left. Yeah, so maybe probably in like within about a month or so, we'll finish this book. So yeah, we can start thinking about what we want to read next. If anyone has suggestions, you can put them in the forum after over the next couple weeks, and we can discuss that. But yeah, so thanks everyone for coming out today, and yeah, hope to see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.
See you next week. Bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot.